Perfect. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming out this evening for our third and final installment of Goulbourn Museum Summer Speaker Series. My name is Jessica Parsons and I'm the program officer at the museum, and I'm happy to be here to introduce today's talk, Cultivating Citizenship, the History of School Gardens in Ontario with Miriam Tepper. I'm online tonight with my colleague Georgian Parks, our programming assistant here at the museum. Georgian will be helping us with the technical behind the scenes work to make sure tonight's event runs smoothly. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I'm speaking to you from tonight and which the Goulbourn Museum occupies. The museum recognizes that the city of Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We extend our respect to all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their valuable past and present contributions to this land. We also recognize and respect the cultural diversity that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples bring to the City of Ottawa. I will now pass it over to Georgian to quickly go over how this evening's events will run.
So first, we will hear about the history of school gardening in Ontario with Miriam. During the presentation, we ask everyone to keep their microphone on mute so that we can all hear the presentation clearly. Afterwards, we will engage in a question and answer period where you may ask Miriam a question by raising your hand using the Zoom reactions feature at the bottom of your screens and then unmuting yourself. You may also ask your question by typing in the chat function. Jessica and I will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation, so feel free to type your questions there at any time and we will attend to them at the end.
Awesome, thank you, Georgian. I will now give a brief introduction of tonight's presenter. Tonight, we'll be hearing from the Goulbourn Museum's program coordinator, Miriam Tepper. Miriam has an MSc in Museum Studies from Leicester University in England. She has worked at many museums in the Ottawa area, including Upper Canada Village and the City of Ottawa Museums, and has volunteered at the Museum of History and the Museum of Nature. She is an avid gardener who maintains an 18-year-old native butterfly garden. Over the past 2 years, Miriam developed and facilitated Growing Goulbourn, a program that brings students into the garden and teaches them how to grow their own vegetables and flowers. Welcome, Miriam. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. I am going to start my PowerPoint presentation in just a moment. Are people able to see this? All right. So I'm going to be talking about cultivating, and can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to be talking about Cultivating Citizenship, a history of school gardens in Ontario, and specifically it's going to be about the history of school gardens from around 1900 to about 1923. So the history of the school garden. The idea of school gardens in Ontario and the rest of Canada was not a new concept. In fact, the idea originated in Europe first in the mid-1860s. The first country that passed a law that schools had to have gardens was in Austria in 1869. This was followed immediately by Sweden, also 1869, and then Belgium, 1873, France, 1882, followed by Russia, Germany, England, and Switzerland. The first North American school garden was in the United States in 1891. It was actually a native plant garden that only included vegetables in 1901. So the concept of a school garden, as I said, originated in Europe and was not new to the Canadians who were thinking about doing this. In fact, it wasn't even new to Canada. New Brunswick started an agricultural education, not necessarily a school garden, but an agricultural education in 1892. And Nova Scotia started school gardens in 1902. So Ontario, like I said, this idea was not coming out of a void. A picture. Well, I told you all of that, and then I did not tell you that with the picture in front of you. Here is a picture of students in Carp, Ontario, gathering flowers in 1905. So the philosophy of where the school gardens came from, you have to have a larger context of what was going on socially, economically, and so on. So this was the time period of the second industrial revolution, which is from the late 1890s to the early 1900s. And the Industrial Revolution was characterized by a lot of mechanization, which, especially in the farming area, what was happening was that mechanization was replacing um, farm hands, and so there was less work in the rural areas, but there was increased work in the cities with the development of factories. So there was this exodus of people from the rural areas into cities. This caused what we know as urbanization, and the urbanization, this rapid urbanization, was causing a lot of problems, such as homelessness, um, lack of employment, um, a huge population density. And the authorities were very genuinely concerned about this. And they had this idea, and it was a social idea, it was an idea among the leaders of the rural or pastoral as this sort of idealistic space. They romanticized the pastoral life. And so they believed that they viewed the farmer as noble, hardworking, earnest, upright, and free of sin through being occupied with good work. And so the question then came, how do we stop these families or these people from moving from this idealized rural pastoral life and into the cities? And the answer was you teach the students. And the idea is that if you teach the students to love the countryside and to love all of this, they will refuse to leave. But how are they going to teach this? Up until this time period, the way of teaching in schools, especially rural schools, was didactic, which means it was taught by rote memorization, by book learning, by reading through textbooks, and through acquiring or looking at abstract ideas. And reformers at this time, believed that this was not effective and was not going to be effective to teach or encourage rural students, to stay in the farmland areas. So what they come up with was that there was a shift from this old education, which was book learning, to this new education. And that's what they called it, the new education. And as what we call in the museum studies and the museum world, didactic learning, which is the teacher tells the student what the information is, the new education was all about what we in the museum field called experiential learning or discovery learning, which is all about a hands-on, self-guided learning mechanism. They also called it object learning at that time period because it was all about dealing with the concrete rather than the abstract word. Schools were seen also. The other thing about new education was that it wasn't about vocation. So the old education was all about vocation. It was economy based and utilitarian, in that children were looking only, or people were teaching children only to give them a vocation, a job, that sort of thing. The new education was much more holistic. The schools were seen as a place that could foster what they thought was civilizing morals, a sense of citizenship, civic duty and responsibility, and a sense of national pride and nationalism. It was a widespread belief that schools could be used to shape social order through this new education. So I have a quote here. The old education stored the mind with knowledge, useful and useless, and only incidentally trained the mind, while the new education puts training in the first place and makes the acquisition of knowledge incidental. The old education was devoted to the study of books, while the new education is devoted to more things than books. The old approach was eminently subjective, dealing largely with abstractions, while the new employs objective methods, preferring the presentation of truth in the concrete. So just as a little side tangent, this philosophy was not relegated just to schools. It was actually the same idea with museums. And most of the museums, such as the public museums, such as actually the Canadian Museum of Nature, was on this philosophy that if you built a museum and stuffed it with information and made it free, you would then invite the urban masses and they would become civilized and develop a sense of nationalism through the museum. But that's another topic entirely. So J.A. Taylor was a big thinker at the time about the idea of what schools could do and how schools could be this moralizing system, and what the new education was, this moralizing system through the schools. J.A. Taylor wrote an article in 1919 called School Gardens, and it was published in the Horticultural Society's magazine. He argued that children in cities are idle and that idleness leads to delinquency. Quote, idleness is the cause of the greatest number of juvenile court cases, most of them by 12 years old, which he argued was the best age to introduce them to gardening. He argued that he believed that children would be more likely to stay in school if they had gardens to tend. He also believed that the gardens would reduce juvenile crime, quote, prisons emptied, police staffs reduced, pauperism abolished, and fewer community parasites. And this was a very common sentiment at the time. He said that there was no homework for children in the city, one of the perils, quote, of the rising generation, and that the average city boy had no chores. And this led to idleness. And so, for example, sawing wood, splitting and piling it has been replaced by the basement furnace. Walking to the post office has been replaced by street delivery. And he, as a child, had to go to the well for water, but children these days now just turn on the tap. So he argued that these gardens dignify labor, they teach industry, they teach that the child should contribute some service to his community and fatherland, and above all, they teach him to be patriotic to the highest interests of the land of his birth. He also said a school garden's enrichment makes noble tastes, refined ideas, elevated thoughts, and lofty ideals, and sweetness of soul. Finally, he said, today, Russia and the other countries, you have to remember that when Russia implemented the school gardens, it was in the 1800s, and now we're talking about Russia in 1919. Other countries are ripe with anarchy. That country alone is safe where the people own their property. A country is in constant peril where the spirit of ownership is absent. We want to develop as much as we can in the minds of the rising generation the spirit of ownership. And so basically, what happened was that the great thinkers at the time felt that the school was the best place to foster these ideas, and the best method of teaching students these ideas was the school garden, and that by using the school garden, they would be able to foster these sentiments that J.A. Taylor has just said. So I'm going to do a few more quotes by a few other people just to elaborate my point, I think. Yes. So this is Cowley in 1905. He says, the school garden will train the urban population to look toward the country. It will train the rural population to remain in the country. It will convince the young mind that the work of the farmer gives scope for intelligence and scholarship, and holds out the promise that a life of industry in the country will win rewards of prosperity, independence, and happiness. And Lockhead goes even further in 1903, where he says there is no more civilizing influence anywhere than that of the school garden. And history tells us that one of the greatest advances in the history of the race occurred when men began the cultivation of plants. He then became a home builder and gave up his wandering nomadic habits. And dramatically, he adds, one writer of the present day believes that the tramp is the product of the tendency cityward, which is so strong in the present age and is a reversion to the primitive habits of our ancestors. The children are crying out for gardens. The home demands a garden. The state should insist upon gardens, and civilization will revert without gardens. So, to summarize, these great reformers at the time thought that the school garden would keep rural children from migrating to the cities. It would foster a sense of ownership, supplement other topics by applying them practically in the garden, geometry, arithmetic, composition, keep children out of trouble by occupying them with wholesome work, foster a sense of nationalism via love for home, and encourage and set up children to pursue careers in farming, contributing economically to the country. I would ask if there's any questions, but I think we are being told to keep our questions. So think about the questions, and then we can come back to it at the end. So the MacDonald-Robertson movement. Those were the thinkers at the time that we just reviewed, but these are the people who acted on it. And these are the people who brought about the school gardens in Ontario, as well as Quebec and the Maritimes. The first fellow is Sir William Christopher MacDonald, who was a tobacco magnate. He was born on February 10th, 1831, in I have tripped over this word several times, Glenaladale, PEI, the youngest son of Donald and Anna. He remained unmarried, and he died in June 9th, 1917 in Montreal. His grandfather was the last in a line of Scottish lairds bearing the title Glenaladale. He toured around, did a bunch of things, but in 1858, which is what we care about, he started a tobacco business with his brother in Montreal. By 1866, he was the only one running it himself. And after the American Civil War, MacDonald may have cornered much of the American crop. So he had a lot. In 1875, he had built the largest tobacco factory in Canada. His employees were French, urban, and over half of them were women and children who he hired very cheaply. He owned the company exclusively, with few assistants, and the ratio of office workers to production workers extremely low. He avoided advertisement, correspondence, and purchasers had to arrange for transportation of products themselves, which all led to a wide profit margin. In 1888, he employed 1,100 people. In 1898, after initially declining the honor, he received a knighthood. But despite becoming a millionaire from his tobacco business, he disliked his own product and was embarrassed and ashamed by it. He declared that he was not proud of his business. It is likely this shame that led him to become a philanthropist starting in the 1880s. He donated heavily to McGill University and set up numerous funds, founded the MacDonald Institute of Home Economics and the MacDonald College, now known as the MacDonald Campus, and is now part of McGill. James Wilson Robertson was born on November 2nd, 1857 in Dunlop, Scotland. He was the fourth of 10 children. He married in 1896 and died on March 19th, 1930. He was raised on a farm in Scotland and then near London, Ontario. He left farming to apprentice as a cheesemaker and was so successful at it that in 1886, he became a professor of dairying at the Ontario Agricultural College in Guelph, despite not having a college education. In 1890, he became the Dominion, for those who are not Canadian, is the term for Canada shortly after the Confederation of 1867. First Commissioner of Agriculture and Dairying, and moved to Ottawa. He introduced silos and promoted corn for ensilage, allowing farmers to dairy through the winter and increase their profits. He also introduced cold storage. Now, Robertson is the man who with the vision. He was a huge supporter of new education. He believed the method strengthened the mind to act for itself, a skill that book learning couldn't teach. He agreed with the thinkers of the time that school gardens would make children into good citizens and keep them from moving into the city. He believed that a love for the school garden would cause enthusiasm and delight in students for the other mundane topics, He went so far as to argue that the whole teaching structure should change and put school gardens first and all other topics as peripheries, and that the majority of learning should be done in the garden. He says, "I have a great faith in rural schools, in its power to mold and build up a national character, but new educational methods must be used in order to secure the best results. In order to make our country life attractive enough to keep our bright boys and girls on the farm, and thus maintain an intelligent, prosperous, progressive, and contented rural people, we must give immediate and effective attention to the needs of the rural school." So his idea, this was his idea, essentially. So MacDonald and Robertson met in 1897. MacDonald read one of Robertson's articles and sent him a letter saying he wanted to meet. They had strongly differing personalities. MacDonald was retiring and Robertson outgoing. MacDonald had this desire that despite employing French, urban Montrealers, mostly women and children, he wanted his funds to focus on English, rural farming families exclusively in the Maritimes. And Robertson was able to convince him to expand the program to Quebec and Ontario. Inspired by Robertson's ideas about the school garden and rural school education in general, MacDonald established the Rural Schools Fund on April 1st, 1902. Over the course of 3 years, MacDonald invested $40,611 in rural gardens and nature study alone, which in 2021 equals to $1.3 million. Over 3 years, just Ontario specifically, cost MacDonald $9,343, which today costs about $30,000. So, the schools. How did it work? Robertson went and he recruited 5 teachers. He and 5 instructors, and they were going to become traveling instructors. So one for each province of Ontario, Quebec, PEI, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And each teacher got 5 schools. Here we have, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we have Beauceville, North Gower, Richmond, Carp, and Galetta. And this was ascribed to J.W. Gibson. The 5 instructors would spend 1 day a week at each school, and the schools were chosen based on proximity to each other so that the teacher could go out every day and go to a different school every day of the week. Robertson took these 5 instructors in the year 1902, and he sent them to Cornell University to learn horticulture, agriculture, and insect life. Then they went to the University of Chicago for nature study. And then they went to Columbia University for the new education methods. Finally, they went back to the Ontario Agricultural College in Guelph, and they practiced making their own plots so that they knew what they were up to before they taught the children. So this is the Richmond School. In the school gardens, 3 primary and practical lessons were taught: the selection of seed, the rotation of crops, and the protection of those crops from insects and disease. Each school had 2 acres, except for Richmond, which had 3 acres. And this is for Beauceville, but basically every single school had the same outline, and we're just going to go through it. So we have the pupil plots in the upper left-hand corner. Each pupil got their own plot. It was theirs. They were 100% responsible for it. The plots were assigned to students based on size, age, and gender. Small girls having the smallest and boys having larger. They had to choose between 3 and 5 types of seeds, one of which had to be flowers. There were about 20 varieties of flowers grown, and they grew beets, cabbage, lettuce, potatoes, radish, tomatoes, barley, beans, clover, oats, and wheat. Right next to them are what are called experimental plots. And the experimental plots were huge community plots that the students would gather around and do group experiments with. So some of the experiments would be rotation of crops, values of different fertilizers, effects of spraying, selection of seed, the merits of different soils, productiveness and quality of various types of crops, and so on and so forth. There was also, as you can see to the left, an orchard. The forestry plot was full of native trees that were economically important to Canada. there were always berries, strawberries, blueberries, currants, so on and so forth, raspberries. The boys got a half-acre campus. The girls got a slightly smaller lawn. And you can see all around that there are decorations, and they have a beautiful entrance to the school and so forth, so on and so forth. This was the idealistic idea of what the school ground was supposed to look like. The pupil plots and the experimental plots absolutely happened. The forestry plots did happen in PEI, for example. The rest, it depended on a variety of factors. The garden shed, which you see just north of the girls' lawn, was absolutely part of it. It was $75, and every school had a shed. Now, what MacDonald did, he paid for the shed, the salary of all the traveling instructors for 3 years, the tool purchase, the seed, ornamental trees, and bush purchase, the preparation of the land. He paid for the fencing and the erection of the garden. He paid for half the cost of the purchase of the land if the land needed to be bought. And he paid for the yearly maintenance for 3 years. This was a 3-year project. And what they hoped to do was to inspire the local ratepayers and the government that this was a good idea, and they would fund it for 3 years, and then the ratepayers and the government would take over, and the gardens would go on in perpetuity. So that's how much MacDonald invested in it. And then Robertson did all the teaching, hiring, instructing, that sort of thing. Let's see. Yes. And then there were a variety of tools, hoes, wheelbarrows, et cetera, et cetera. So MacDonald paid for all of that. So what happened after 3 years? Well, the government kicked in. In 1903, actually, the government helped support the Robertson MacDonald program, or the agricultural rural funds. In 1903, the government of Ontario offered $100 grants to teachers to start a school garden, followed by $10 grants maintenance every year after that, until 1907. The teachers who went to the Ontario Agricultural College to gain agricultural education were also given grants and had their transportation costs paid for by the Ontario government. The fund, the MacDonald Rural School Funds, ended in 1906. The Ontario government kept grants until 1907, and in 1907 in Ontario, there were 33 schools qualified for the grants, which means they had started them in 1903. In 1911, Ontario created the position of the Director of Elementary Agricultural Education and appointed S.B. McCready. He brought the number of school gardens from 17 in 1911 to 99 by 1913. In 1913, the federal government created the Agricultural Instruction Act as a response to the Royal Commission on Industrial Training and Technical Education, chaired by Robertson. Robertson himself reports that school gardens were failing and needed reviving to survive. The act distributed $10 million, which right now is $283 million, over 10 years to all the provinces. Each province could choose how to spend the money. Ontario spent it mostly on textbooks, courses, and materials, and only Quebec created a special superintendent of school gardens. Grants was given out to school gardens as well. In 1913 to 1914, the federal government gave Ontario $10,000, which is now $283,000, specifically for agricultural education in public schools, including gardens. And I don't know the rest because there was way too much research. So we can just extrapolate that they gave them the equivalent between 1913 and the end. By 1921, 1,800 schools qualified for the school garden grant. The act funding ended in 1923. And at the end of 1923, there was no more financial support from anyone for school gardens, and the gardens petered out. I'm just going to go very briefly on school fairs. The school fairs were meant to encourage school gardens. And so there were a variety of things that could happen. So the plots were judged based on neatness and tidiness. And so schools, children would be paid a little bit here and there based on the plot neatness. They could compete against each other for the best produce, so on and so forth. And so the school fairs were very tightly tied to the school gardens, to the point that the school fairs were actually separate from country fairs, because it was supposed to be just for the students and for the students to enjoy themselves. And there were other competitions, baking, sports, that sort of thing. So we have this little picture from 1920 something of this little girl with her trophy for the Dwyer Hill School. The schools would create these banners and then parade into the school fairgrounds behind the banners. And then on the right, we have the Rural School Fairs Goulbourn Township plaque. The plaque was given to schools that won the school fair 3 times in a row. And the dates are 1921, 22, and 23. So, did it work? Did the schools work? The only information we have is anecdotal. There were no data experiments. So according to one person, Cowley, teachers claimed that, quote, troublesome students became, quote, orderly and docile. Attendance increased and students had a deeper interest in other topics. Another individual said that it was easier to teach students abstract reasoning like physics, chemistry, arithmetic, and algebra after hands-on learning in the garden, and students did not want to be absent on garden days. So there was some anecdotal information that it did in fact work. And here we have the heart of the garden in Galata. The end of the school garden, as I said, the funding ended in 1923. There was no funding after that, and therefore the school garden petered. It was not an ideal program. There was a series of problems. One was parental indifference. Sparse attendance over the summer months. The summer vacation was too long, and Gibson, the teacher for Ontario, suggested that school start on August 1st to solve this problem. There was a lack of success. Sometimes there was one school that was plagued by caterpillars, and they had to replant the garden 4 times. And by that time, the students just weren't interested. They were too discouraged, and they lost all interest. Infestations, poor soil. So the school locations were often chosen because the soil was bad. And farmers, of course, wanted good soil, and so they stuffed the schools wherever the soil was not so good. And so they had problems like that. The last problem they had was that there was a high teacher turnover. They were paid very poorly. Most of them wanted to work in the city, and then the teachers would just simply rotate through, and the traveling instructors or whomever it was would have to restart. So here we are harvesting and plowing in Carp, Ontario. I'm going to now show you some photos. So here is Richmond in 1903. We have North Gower, Ontario, in 1905. Bowesville, 1905. Carp, 1905. These are all from the same article. And Galata. And my favorite, this is Richmond. And if you look at all the students, you can see just how happy and enthusiastic and thrilled they are to be there. And I love this photo. This is definitely my favorite photo. So, Growing Goulbourn. How much time do we have left? Good God. Growing Goulbourn. So I was hired to develop a program that brought grade 6 students from Goulbourn Middle School, just down the road, to the museum has a little garden. It's a nice little plot. It's right next to the museum on the far side. And I was hired to develop a program around that garden and to bring in grade 6 students to come and work in the garden. The inside is vegetables and the outside is native plants. The program was broken down into 7 lessons. The first lesson was School Gardens, the Purpose Then and Now, which is basically an abbreviated version of this presentation. How plants are organized, scientific exploration. And so we looked at phylogenetic trees, how plants are related to each other, looking at genetic cousins, that sort of thing. Plants, the diversity and how we use them. So we looked at where our plant products came from. So dye, incense, soy products, that sort of thing. Plants, their needs and ours. So what do plants need in order to grow? Our land was looking at the history of Goulbourn, how it's been used over time and who has been using it. And finally, our biodiversity, which was looking at the threat of invasive species and the importance of our local native plants. Food, people, and our environment, where we were looking at food loss and waste, food security, and the agricultural impact on climate change. So for school gardens, they planted indoors cucumbers, tomatoes, and beans. Lesson 2, indoors, they transplanted those plants into larger pots. In 3, they came to the garden and they cleared it. 4, they planted the vegetable garden. 5, they planted companion herbs and potatoes. 6, they planted native plants. And 7, they just did some cleanup and we had a party, our own school fair. So this is what the garden looked like at the beginning. It had been built in 2019, and because of the pandemic, it had sadly been neglected for 2 to 3 years. And so this is what they were facing on the first day. This is what it looks like afterwards. There's the tomatoes in the right-hand corner, the beans on the left, cucumbers are on the far side. They also chose and planted onions, pumpkins, cabbage, and carrots. And all of the vegetables are heritage vegetables from a catalog from 1905. And so what I wanted was that there might be a chance that the varieties that the students planted this past summer might have been the same varieties that the students were planting in 1905. So they're all heirloom heritage varieties. They planted their own plants. Here are the tomatoes. They chose their own plants. They did a vote, and then they planted them. They also played a variety of games and activities. Here they are playing a game that I invented and failed miserably. And then on the very final day, we had a school fair, which was full of games, potato spoon races, bocce, except with beets, pin the carrot to the donkey's mouth or feed the donkey a carrot. But this one was the most popular. It was the watermelon weightlifting competition. And this child here is doing exactly what I told them not to do, which is raise the watermelon above their head. But we had a very hard time getting the students back to school because they were all weightlifting watermelons. It was very weird, but they enjoyed themselves. And then finally, they did this program. They answered this poster, and I think the vast majority of answer was their favorite part was the pizza. But after the pizza, their favorite part were the plants, and they had a great time planting, watching the plants grow, looking after the plants. That was definitely their second favorite part after the pizza. And this was 13 of the 17 when we took this photo. Unfortunately, some of them were missing. But we also took this photo, which we recreated that photo from Richmond of all of those children looking miserable. And we recreated it. And here's the end result. And it's definitely one of my favorites. Thank you.